Where the Light Still Reaches a Space Opera, Part 1. The relief ship Solace had no weapons, no armor plating worth the name, and a hull painted a soft, deliberate white that every spacefaring culture in the Threnody Accord had, by long convention, agreed not to fire upon. It was, in the words of its own crew, the least intimidating vessel in known space, and that had always been the point. Dr. Mireille Katz had served aboard the Solace for 11 years, longer than any other member of its rotating medical staff, and in that time she had learned that the ship's greatest strength was never speed or firepower. It was the simple fact that it always came. Famine, plague, reactor fallout, the slow grinding disasters that struck civilizations too small or too poor to matter to anyone with a fleet. The Solace went where the Threnody Accord's larger, more self-important vessels did not bother to go, and it went without asking who owed whom anything first. "We have a problem," said Captain Deho Lin, stepping onto the observation deck where Mireille was reviewing the day's medical logs. He was a quiet man, precise in a way that made his crew trust him more than his rank did, and he did not say the word problem unless he meant it. How large a problem? The kind with warships in it. Mireille set down her data slate. "Show me." The display resolved into a system neither of them had visited before. A single temperate world called Ith Vahl by its people, unaligned with any of the 11 major powers, its population numbering perhaps 4 million, spread across low, tangled cities that had never needed to prepare for anything larger than seasonal storms. Around it, in a loose but unmistakably deliberate formation, sat 11 warships bearing the insignia of the Korveth Directorate, a rigid security-obsessed power that controlled the trade lanes on the system's only approach. Ith Vahl reported an outbreak 6 weeks ago, Deho said. A respiratory pathogen, fast-spreading, high mortality in children and the elderly. They don't have the medical infrastructure to characterize it, let alone treat it. They sent out a general distress call under the Accord's humanitarian charter. We were the closest ship equipped to answer it. And the Korveth ships? Arrived 4 days ago. They've sealed the system. No ships in, no ships out until, and I'm quoting their official statement, the risk of extraplanetary contagion has been eliminated. Mireille felt something cold settle into her chest, the particular kind of cold that came from having seen this exact shape of cruelty before, dressed in different, more clinical language each time. Eliminated how? They haven't said, but 4 million people behind a blockade with the disease burning through their population and no outside medical support isn't a containment strategy, Mireille. It's a death sentence with a public health justification stapled to the front of it. She looked at the tactical display, at the small, huddled shape of Ith Vahl, surrounded by 11 ships that had not come to help. Have they let anyone through? Aid, supplies, anything? They offered to accept data, genetic sequencing, epidemiological models, anything Ith Vahl's own scientists could transmit for outside analysis. No physical cargo, no personnel. Their logic is that any ship coming out could be carrying the pathogen with it. And any ship going in is a ship that might not come back out clean. So the safest solution from where they're sitting is to let nothing move at all until the outbreak burns itself out on its own. And if it doesn't burn out on its own, if it just burns through all 4 million of them first? Deho didn't answer that because there was no answer that made it better. The Solace's own medical division had already begun cross-referencing the transmitted genetic data with the ship's considerable pathogen library. One of the few genuine advantages of being the vessel every desperate world eventually called. Since over 11 years, the Solace had built up a broader working knowledge of xenobiology than most planetary hospitals could manage in a lifetime. By the second day, Mireille's junior researcher, a sharp, exhausted young man named Foster Okonkwo Reyes, found something the Korveth's own analysts working only from remote data had apparently missed. "It's not novel," Foster said, practically vibrating with the specific fatigue of someone who has been right about something important and has not yet convinced anyone who matters. It's a mutated strain of something we've already got a treatment protocol for. Cousin pathogen. Showed up on a Threnody world 8 years ago. Different enough to fool a surface genetic scan. Similar enough that our existing antiviral compound should work on it, or close enough that we could adapt it in days, not months. You're certain? As certain as I can be without live samples to confirm it, but Mireille, we have the compound. We have it sitting in storage on this ship right now, in quantities that could plausibly treat a population the size of Ith Vahl's, if we synthesized more from the base culture during transit. We are completely by accident of scheduling the single most useful ship in this entire sector for this exact crisis. And we are currently not allowed within 4 systems of it. Yes, Foster said, that's the part I was hoping you'd have an idea about. Mireille didn't, not yet, but she requested a channel to the Korveth Blockade command anyway because doing nothing had never once been a strategy she was willing to accept, and because somewhere below that ring of warships, 4 million people were dying of something the Solace almost certainly knew how to stop. The officer who answered the channel introduced herself as Fleet Overseer Trask Ilvane, and she listened to Mireille's proposal. Safe passage for one unarmed medical vessel, full transparency, full quarantine protocol on approach and return, with the patient, unhurried courtesy of someone who had already made her decision and was simply waiting for the other party to finish talking. Doctor, Ilvane said, I don't doubt your ship's medical capabilities, I don't doubt your intentions, but I have a directive from my government to prevent this contagion from leaving that system by any means, and every model my analysts have built says the highest risk vector for exactly that outcome is a ship traveling in and back out again. I am not going to authorize the one action that turns an isolated outbreak into a potential sector-wide one on the strength of a hopeful hypothesis from a doctor I have never met. 4 million people are dying in there. I am aware of the cost of my decision, Doctor. I have simply concluded it is smaller than the alternative. You don't know that. You're guessing the same way I am. Except my guess comes with a treatment and yours comes with a wall. There was a pause on the line, and when Ilvane spoke again, something in her voice had shifted from bureaucratic patience into something closer to genuine, tired honesty. I have buried people to contagion before, Dr. Katz. An entire station once because someone made exactly the choice you're asking me to let you make, and they were wrong. And 11,000 people died somewhere they should have been safe instead of exposed. I would rather be the officer who let 4 million die of a disease than the one who let it become 40 million because I trusted a hopeful stranger. That is not cruelty. That is arithmetic I have already done the hard way once. She closed the channel before Mireille could answer, and for the first time in 11 years aboard the Solace, Mireille Katz found herself without any idea of what to do next. Part 2. The Solace held position at the edge of the blockade for 6 days, close enough to watch the slow tightening of the Korveth cordon, far enough to avoid becoming a provocation. During those 6 days, Ith Vahl's own transmitted reports grew steadily worse. Hospital capacity exceeded, then hospital capacity meaningless because there were no longer enough medical staff standing to run the hospitals that remained. Foster's projected treatment compound sat finished and useless in the Solace's storage bay, enough doses for the entire planet going nowhere. It was Deho who found the seam in the problem, not because he was cleverer than anyone else aboard, but because he had spent 11 years thinking about ships the way other captains thought about weapons, as tools with more uses than their design specifications suggested. Overseer Ilvane's directive is to stop contagion from crossing the blockade, he said, gathering Mireille and Foster in the small galley that served as the Solace's unofficial council chamber. Ships in. Ships out. That's what her sensors are built to track. That's what her directive is built to prevent, so we don't send a ship. I don't follow, Mireille said. We send the medicine, not the Solace. Not any crude vessel at all. Deho pulled up a schematic on the galley's battered display. One of the Solace's small unmanned relief drones typically used for orbital supply drops onto worlds too underdeveloped to have proper landing infrastructure. These drones were built for exactly this kind of delivery. No crew aboard means no possibility of a crew member carrying anything back out. We load the treatment compound, we broadcast the complete manifest and flight plan to Ilvane's command in advance so there's no ambiguity about intent. And we send 12 of them down to 12 separate distribution points on the surface. Nothing comes back. Nothing needs to. Foster leaned forward. Her directive is about contagion moving through the blockade, a drone going one direction permanently carrying medicine and nothing else. That's not the vector her models are built to worry about. It might still violate the letter of her orders, Mireille said. She said no cargo, she was clear about that. Then we ask her anyway, Deho said, properly, in full view of her own command with the complete data behind it. So that if she says no a second time, it isn't because she never had the chance to say yes. Mireille reopened the channel to Fleet Overseer Ilvane that evening. And this time she did not lead with the moral argument. Because she had already learned that Ilvane did not need to be convinced that 4 million lives mattered. She led instead with the schematic, the flight plan, the one-way trajectory data, the complete chemical breakdown of the treatment compound, and Foster's full epidemiological modeling. And she laid it all out with the plain, unhurried thoroughness of someone presenting evidence rather than pleading a case. 12 drones, Ilvane said when the presentation finished. Unmanned, one way. No return trip, no crew exposure, no vector back through my line. That's correct. And if your compound doesn't work? If Foster Okonkwo Reyes's hypothesis about strain similarity turns out to be wrong? Then 4 million people are exactly as dead as they would have been if we'd never tried, Mireille said. You lose nothing you weren't already prepared to lose. You only stand to gain something you weren't expecting to get. The silence that followed was longer this time, and Mireille had learned enough about Ilvane in the past week to recognize it not as hesitation but as genuine calculation. The specific, careful arithmetic of someone rebuilding a decision from its foundations rather than defending the one she'd already made. I buried 11,000 people once for trusting the wrong hopeful stranger, Ilvane said finally. I have spent every day since telling myself I would never make that mistake again, and I built my entire career on the certainty that I hadn't. Your proposal doesn't ask me to trust you, Doctor. It asks me to authorize a delivery mechanism my own directive was never written to prohibit because nobody who wrote it imagined a ship clever enough to ask this particular favor instead of the one I was braced to refuse. A pause. That is either the most sophisticated manipulation I have encountered in 30 years of service, or it is exactly what it appears to be. I find against my better instincts that I believe it is the second thing. Then let us send them. I will allow 12 drones, unmanned exactly as specified, under continuous sensor observation by my own ships throughout transit. If anything about this deviates from what you have shown me, anything at all, I will not hesitate to destroy them mid-flight, and I want you to understand that I mean that as a statement of procedure, not a threat. Understood, Mireille said. And Overseer, thank you. Don't, Ilvane said not unkindly. Thank me if it works. Until then, I have simply agreed to be less certain than I was this morning, and I am finding that considerably more uncomfortable than you might expect. The 12 drones launched at first light on the 7th day, threading a corridor through the Korveth blockade that Ilvane's own ships had cleared and monitored with the exacting care of an overseer determined to have nothing go wrong that could have been prevented. Miracle watched the tactical display in something close to silent prayer, though she had not been a praying woman in the ordinary sense for a very long time. The drones reached the surface within the hour. Distribution began within 2. Part 3. It took 9 days to know for certain whether Foster's hypothesis had been right. And they were the longest 9 days Mireille Katz had spent aboard the Solace in 11 years of service. Ith Vahl's transmitted reports came in fragments at first. A hospital in the northern city reporting reduced fever in a small test group, then reduced fever in a larger one, then on the 6th day, the first cautious mention of patients well enough to be discharged rather than merely stabilized. By the 9th day, the reports had stopped sounding cautious at all. "It's working," Foster said, staring at the incoming data with the stunned, hollowed-out relief of a man who had spent every night since the launch quietly terrified he'd been wrong. "It's actually working, Mireille. Mortality's dropping across every reporting district. They're saying full recovery within another 2 to 3 weeks for most active cases." Mireille didn't answer right away. She was watching the tactical display instead, where Fleet Overseer Ilvane's ships remained in their same careful formation around Ith Vahl. Unmoved, unmoving. The visible shape of a directive that had not yet been rescinded, even as the crisis it was built to contain quietly resolved itself 4 million lives at a time. She opened the channel one more time. "Overseer Ilvane, I imagine you've seen the same reports we have." "I have." Something in Ilvane's voice had changed since the first conversation, 6 days into what felt now like a much older story. "I have also spent the last week reviewing my own directive line by line, trying to determine precisely where in it I made the decision that got 4 million people this close to dying anyway. And I have not yet located the exact sentence. I suspect that's because it was never a single sentence. It was simply the ordinary shape of caution, applied without enough imagination about what it might cost. You made the decision you thought was safest with the information you had. I made the decision I have made a dozen times before in a dozen situations that were not actually the same situation, and I called it consistency because it felt safer than admitting I didn't know how to tell the difference until someone showed me." A pause. "My government will ask me to justify the delay before authorizing your solution. I intend to tell them the truth, that a Threnody relief ship, with no directive obligating it to solve my problem for me, solved it anyway, in a way that cost my directive nothing, and would have cost me everything if I had refused to consider it. I do not expect that to be a comfortable report to file. You could also simply not file it." "I could," Ilvane agreed. "I am, however, informed that Overseer Ilvane, whatever her other qualities, has never once been accused of taking the comfortable option." Another pause, and when she spoke again there was something almost like humor in it, dry and tired and entirely genuine. "The blockade will begin standing down within the hour, Dr. Katz. Full trade and travel access restored to Ith Vahl within 48. I would ask, if it isn't too great an imposition, that the Solace remain in system until my medical liaisons have had the opportunity to properly document Foster Okonkwo Reyes's treatment protocol. Not as a condition, as a request. I find I would like to understand exactly how a hopeful hypothesis turned into the thing that fixed what my own certainty nearly broke." "We'll stay as long as you need." "Thank you," Ilvane said, and then, after a silence long enough that Mireille almost thought the channel had closed, "For what it's worth, and I recognize it may not be worth a great deal given the cost of the week it took me to say it, I am glad you did not accept my first answer as final. We don't generally, Mireille said. It's more or less the entire purpose of this ship. Word of the Ith Vahl blockade reached the wider Threnody Accord in the careful, understated language of an official incident report rather than the loud momentum of a battle narrative, and for that reason it moved more slowly through the Accord's halls than Elena Voss's fleet had years earlier in a different corner of the same galaxy. But it moved. Overseer Ilvane's own filed account did not soften her initial decision or excuse it, and it did not need to. The plain fact of what had happened, a small unarmed relief ship finding the exact narrow space between one government's caution and 4 million lives, and choosing to stand in it rather than simply accept the answer it had first been given, traveled on its own, the way that kind of story always seemed to, from one small, overlooked world to the next. The Solace received in the following months an unusual number of new requests for its specific class of vessel from smaller, non-aligned worlds, who had until then assumed no one with real capability would bother answering when they called. De Ho Lin, reviewing the growing list with something between pride and exhaustion, remarked to Mireille one evening on the observation deck that the ship was going to need a second hull soon just to keep up with everyone who had started believing it might actually come. Good, Mireille said. Let them believe it. We intend to keep being right about it. Below them, Ith Vahl turned quietly in its orbit, its cities lit again in the ordinary, unremarkable way of a world that had stopped being an emergency and gone back to simply being a place where people lived. Which was, Mireille had come to understand after 11 years of this work, the only outcome that had ever actually mattered. The end.